Hi, everyone. Welcome to Disrupting Stereotypes in the Classroom. I'm Dr. Angela Nardozi, and I'm just getting us all set up here. So thank you so much for your patience. If all goes well, we should be being joined by Dr. Jean-Paul Restoule. And so we're just waiting for that technical piece to come through. I'm so happy that you've joined us today. Jean-Paul, there you are. Oh, I can see Jean-Paul, but can I hear? Yes, now I feel like I can hear him. Hello.
Hi. I was just going to ask if you want me to have my headphones too.
I think I can hear you okay, and I'm looking over at our technical friend, Danny, for a thumbs up, and I'm getting it. I'm getting the thumbs up. Wonderful. I think we're good.
Put them on or thumbs up, everything's okay.
Everything's fine. No headphones needed. And are we good? Are you hearing me okay?
Absolutely. Crystal clear.
Wonderful. Okay, well, great. I'm so excited to see you. We're in two different places, and before we get rolling and introduce ourselves and tell people where we are, I just wanted to welcome people to the webinar today and remind them as we get going that we have 4 hashtags which are at the bottom of our screen today. You'll see them on the, I think, the bottom right-hand corner: EdChat, FNMI Ed, ON EdChat, and BC EdChat. If people want to take the conversation offline, to Twitter, that is. But we also have our chat on the side here. So hopefully everybody's sound is working. And Jean-Paul, who are you? Tell us who you are.
Bonjour, Jean-Paul Restoule Nanishnikaz, Wishak Nodem, Okingadot Minasing Nadonjiba Nishnabe and Dao, Wayman Tagoshi and Dao. And it's a beautiful day here out on the West Coast. It's a great privilege to live and work and play on traditional unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people and the Senchatan-speaking people. And that's the Songhees, the Esquimalt First Nations, and also the Saanich people. I introduced myself in Anishinaabe or Ojibwe language, a language I've approached as an adult learner and speaker. And it's from where I was raised and grew up. So I grew up in a small town northwest of Toronto, discovered my connection to the Dokis First Nation later in life, and have been exploring what it means to learn about being an Indigenous person outside of those communities, and I said in urban areas, but really it's all the land is Anishinaabe land there where we grew up, and now here I am on Lekwungen speaking territory and with Senchatan speaking territory. So it's a grateful visitor role that I now take on since I've come out here last September. And that's my long intro.
Thanks, Jean-Paul. And I think in that you acknowledge the territory in that. Am I correct? Or is anything else you want to say about the territory you're on, or should we keep rolling?
Well, I did mention it's unceded, and I think that's an important thing to return to when we do our land acknowledgements, to know whether there is a treaty relationship in place, and all of that obligation and responsibility that entails, or if it's unceded territory and so the Aboriginal title still stands. And so I try to make sure I include that when I do a land acknowledgement here.
Thanks for filling in that gap. That's awesome. Well, I can tell people a little bit about who I am. My name is Angela Nardozi, and I'm a settler and I'm a guest on Turtle Island. My family, both sides of my family, came to Turtle Island from Italy, and I grew up in Markham, Ontario. And it was about 11 years ago now that I began, after doing my BEd, working with Indigenous communities. Specifically, I started my work up in Treaty 3 area in, I guess, middle to northern Ontario. And for the past 10 years since, I've been working mainly with educators about what is our role as settler and / non-Indigenous people in this work. And so today I'm coming to you from, we're doing like a little bit of a cross-country situation. I'm coming to you from Toronto, and I want to acknowledge the Mississauga peoples, who this is their traditional territory, also the Seneca peoples, We also acknowledge here the Petun First Nations. And I also put up an image of the dish with one spoon, because that is one of the, I believe, and John Paul, you might want to correct me on this one, but I believe it's a pre-contact treaty. I'm still learning more about it, and it's an agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples around the Great Lakes watershed about sharing a common dish, metaphorically really, of food and resources together in peace, i.e. with one spoon. And there's many, many teachings that go along with that I'm just learning as a non-Indigenous person, and I'm learning from Indigenous colleagues. John Paul, how did that sound? How did I do with that one so far?
Sounds great to me. I'm not 100% sure about the timing of that relationship, but I think it definitely was not including settler people to start. But I think they were invited into it later.
Yeah, so that is something I need to keep thinking about and keep understanding more about. So thanks for jumping in on that one. And I think before we really dive into our subject today, there's a few things that we wanted to talk about. John Paul, we did a webinar series. Can you tell us more about this whole concept of what we're hoping to do with this?
Well, I guess it's important to acknowledge that much of the impetus for this work or this series actually is a research project that I'm involved with that includes ways of supporting teachers to take up Indigenous education in the work that they do and to understand better the kinds of things that help or prevent teachers from doing Indigenous education work in their professional practice. And part of what we thought we'd do with this work is reach out to teachers and provide some supports. And in return, just ask that you fill out a few questions. At the end, we'll have a link to a really short survey where we're just trying to collect some really basic info from working teachers right now as part of that project. So it is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And, ooh, look at that. And then we use this word, Gekano Hamagewin, which comes from Anishinaabe or the Ojibwe language. And it's a word that describes like teaching. And so it's just like the concept of teaching, but if you break it apart, there's all these little things in it that kind of give you access to Indigenous worldview. Like kith is the first part of that word, and it's kind of related to earth in that way. And then the other parts of the word are speaking to like a pointing direction. So like you're being pointed the way to something. And so it's almost like the earth points the way, or you're learning from the land. So I mean, I don't know that a lot of our Indigenous education looks like that in public schools, but certainly that notion of traditional Indigenous education being that we learn from the land, we learn from the community. And so trying to get back to some of those ideas and ways of thinking is something that we bring into the philosophy of what Indigenous education is. So it can be learning from the land, it can be learning from others in the community who bring what they have learned, whether it's through traditional teachings, through narrative, through storytelling, or if it's through revealed knowledge, or if it's through empirical knowledge. But there's a certain way, there's a certain protocol in each territory about how you come to know something. And then sharing that wisdom and that knowledge is part of Indigenous education. Now, of course, there's the other side of things too, which makes this concept such a big thing. But I think it's also about understanding the relationship of Canadian people to Indigenous people and all of the things that characterize that relationship. So it's one of intense colonialism at times, of ongoing colonialism that changes and shifts and becomes different in kind. And if you can illuminate that for our young students through teaching them about the Indian Act or treaty relationships or those kinds of things that in which all Canadians have a responsibility or a responsibility to know about or responsibility to act upon, that to me is also a form of Indigenous education, even as it's not emanating from Indigenous communities per se. but an important thing to include in our work. But Gikino Homogawin is meant to refer to all of those things. And we're hoping that with this webinar series, we'll be able to cover a lot of topics related to how to support teachers doing that work.
Absolutely, and I'm really looking forward to going on this journey with you, John Paul. And I know that we have a lot of great ideas about what's next, and we're eager to hear from folks. One of the questions, I think the last question on the survey that people will see after they close the webinar is about what future topics that they're interested to see in a webinar. So we're really excited to see what people's feedback is on that. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So we've done the thank you to our sponsors. Yes. Shirk. Wonderful.
Yes, we have to get important. They are certainly helping to fund the work that we're doing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And just really quickly, what we're hoping to do today is we're going to start talking about our topic, deconstructing stereotypes, just in a minute now. And at the end of that, we're going to have a question and answer period if you have any questions for us. So please feel free to put your questions right directly into the chat. And Erica, who is with us coming from the University of Victoria today, is in the room. Yay, Erica! Erica is going to be finding those questions and putting them aside for John Paul and I so that we can keep track and get to them after we do our little talk. And then we've got some final notes, and that should be the hour. So I'm really excited. Without further ado, I'm going to get John Paul started, and I might close my camera for just a bit, just because there's a little bit of a technical issue that I want to resolve with my tech guy over here, Danny. So, John Paul, what are stereotypes?
Okay, I'll get started on that, and I do hope that once the tech is addressed, that you feel comfortable jumping in at any point too and helping out, because certainly welcome your ideas on this, and I'm going to forget things, so it's always good to have someone else weigh in. But stereotype for me, we're not really looking at things that are necessarily true or false. The thing about stereotypes and where they get their power from is that they kind of naturalize a certain way of knowing about a group of people. And you can make a generalization about a whole people that allows you to make a quick judgment or understanding about that group. And so it's important to think about how that's not a true or false kind of statement, but rather is it overgeneralized. And the reason why that's important is because people can usually point to one or two examples and say, well, you see, they're all like this. Well, the problem is that generalization of saying they are all like this. It's not really that there are no examples that exist. That's how the power works, is that you can easily go from one or two examples to treating all people the same way. So the other thing to think about with stereotypes is that they kind of reside out there, like outside of our own making. We kind of inherit them, if that makes sense. Like we kind of are born into them as we learn our languages and as we view images on television or from movies or in our books, in our education textbooks. We encounter the stereotypes. So they kind of pre-exist us, and then they're there for us to kind of use, like to repopulate, recirculate, almost like currency, like it has a certain kind of power if you amass it and use it against the group in question. So they kind of circulate around us everywhere, and the way in which you kind of take it and apply it is the way that you are using that power. So it's kind of open to anyone to use and abuse, but what you tend to see is that stereotypes largely are about people with less power, marginalized people, and it's the people who are not marginalized in a relationship with that group who can then use the stereotype. The scary thing about it, though, and we'll see this in our image when we get to it, is the marginalized group can also start to believe the stereotypes. And then that leads to kind of issues with self-esteem, but also lateral violence. So you can certainly use stereotypes against other members of your own group. And so this is kind of where the power of stereotypes reside, in that they're everywhere, they're accessible to anyone and everyone, and they're not untrue, but they're overgeneralized. And I think the reason we want to talk about it this month, right, is because this is, the month of October, you tend to get, and I was just talking about this with some colleagues, there's a number of Indigenous stereotypes that are recirculated in costumes. And you start to see everything from the young children dressing as Indian braves, warriors, princesses, or Pocahontas, the Disney version or otherwise, all the way up to the adult costumes with like the Pocahontas and those kind of costumes. And so it's problematic, and it's like an annual thing where you kind of have to address it. But just thinking about it this time of year makes me think about how they're encoded throughout all of education in course textbooks, and you'll see them everywhere.
John Paul, I couldn't help but laugh at Pocahontas. Thank you for ensuring that yes made it into our webinar. But I think for me, just building on what you're saying, John Paul, the key to that is, like, if you haven't already, you're a classroom teacher, now is the time to act, because young people we know are so excited the day that they come to school, if they do come to school with their costumes, and approaching a young child or the day of and saying, hey, I don't know about your costume, isn't always the best. There a lot of shame or guilt could come up. So starting now, doing that education now, talking to students about their costume choices, what costumes may be offensive, to different ethnicities, cultures, religious groups. Important to do that preemptively, I think.
Yeah, it's a good thing, because if you approach it now and you're telling why it's a problem now, it's not like you're directly confronting that person, right? So they don't get defensive, they don't get uncomfortable. It's more like, oh, maybe I should think twice about wearing that. I had my headdress all ready to go, and now I can't wear it anywhere. But if you're taking that out in a safe time before it becomes an issue, hopefully it's early enough. I don't know, it's the 23rd. But I mean, October is also the month in Canada for Thanksgiving. And so you also get stereotypes about Indigenous people welcoming settlers to the land through big feasts and things like that. And it's again, kind of a misnomer, and it's tied to a lot of other stereotypes about Indian giving and so forth. But October is a good month to discuss these
Absolutely.
things.
And I think that's perfectly, succinctly to say that's why we chose this topic this month, right?
Oh yeah.
Just moving on really quickly, we wanted to make a note to folks as we go through this webinar that stereotypes are tricky to talk about, because neither of us mean to do any harm to people in mentioning or bringing them up, but we do run that risk, right? A lot of just as John Paul was saying, stereotypes by nature are very damaging, and can bring a lot of, bad memories for folks if they've ever been weaponized against them, or stereotypes are the only way that they've been allowed to see themselves in the curriculum, etc. But we do think it's important to lay out on the table, what are John Paul and I still seeing in classrooms? What do we still see, or what do we know that children still believe based on our work with them, and the messages that are out there in society? So we kind of, we walk that, we do that dance. We sort of walk that fine line as we do this work. Yeah. Is there anything else to say about that, John Paul?
Yeah, I just think you're absolutely right. Like it's difficult to talk about it because you run the risk of offending people. It can traumatize people to put these things out there. But I think it's even worse to not mention them and not confront them, because then you just let it continue. And one of the other reasons it's tricky to talk about is I will probably use the word Indian in this talk today, which I know it's often said, don't use that word, but it's used in a particular way. I'm using it because I think when people do the stereotype, they're doing a stereotype of an Indian, and it's like a way of knowing all Indigenous people as inseparable and all of one thing. and that's part of its power. And it's also, you have to use that word because it's kind of what's really going on. I think is people are recreating that stereotype of what an Indian is. It's like I don't know how you talk about these kinds of costumes or stereotypes without calling it that, because it's certainly not someone doing a First Nations person. Like if they were trying to do something more politically correct or respectful, it wouldn't look the way that a lot of these things do.
Totally agree. And I think we can't avoid it if we're going to talk about the Indian Act, right, which is still law in Canada, right, or Indian status. Like this word is still so embedded in all of, like sort of government policy. I know we use Indigenous now, and Justin Trudeau talks about Indigenous and nations, but still we have this word. So thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah, it's not the Indigenous Act yet.
No.
So I think, that's another thing for teachers is terminology and getting accurate terminology, because there are times when Indian is the correct word to use, especially when it's emerging from legislation or policy where that's the word that's being used, or you're talking about status Indians and you really mean that's a particular meaning in Canada's laws, so you have to use it. But that I'm just trying to say today, I'm using it in a way that I hope is it's an informed way, and I'm not trying to slide into equivocating it with any of the other terms that were being used
Perfect.
today.
Okay, so speaking of which, we have some examples of stereotypes in schools that I've run into, John Paul. I wonder if you see these reflected in teaching now. Some of them are hard to get away from and kind of sneak up on people. Like the first one, Indigenous people are all very close to nature. I know it's so important to talk about Indigenous worldviews, and some, I have a hard time, to be very honest with you, walking that fine line between talking about them, but then not thinking of like, Indigenous people lived in this perfect, harmony with nature at all times, and then my students walk away thinking that they continue to, and then when they encounter this image of an Indigenous person, maybe in their day-to-day life, who, I don't know, litters, they just it does not compute, like what are your thoughts on that?
First the tear, and then sorry, that reference to Iron Eyes Cody from the 70s PSAs. But there's, I think one time we talked, Angela and I talked about this kind of a spectrum almost, where people could talk about Indigenous people in a very demeaning way, and talk about all of the negative things, and then go all the way to a really romanticized view of what Indigenous people in life are like. And both ways of stereotyping cause harm to Indigenous people because it dehumanizes, whether you're romanticizing or villainizing. And so that's the other thing to be worried about is this characterization dehumanizing? Are we taking away from the diverse kind of individual experiences of Indigenous people by assuming all of them are close to nature? And it also denies a certain kind of experience or set of experiences that are a legacy of colonization and other factors. But like to blame an Indigenous person for not knowing their language when their family went to residential schools and were survivors of that system. I mean, that was a system that was designed to take away language and culture. So you then can't blame the person who doesn't know their language for that, if that's part of the legacy their families went through. And I think it's similar to the natural thing, is that so many Indigenous people have been encouraged, or I use that word kind of in quotes too, encouraged or forced away from relationships to traditional lands and territories, with urbanization incentives and sometimes with laws and policies that prevented them from remaining in the places where they were, or forced displacement and removal from lands. And so when descendants of those families grow up in a way that they don't have the same kind of ties to nature that might be suggested within the languages or traditional culture. It's a repeat of that kind of that problem. So there's that stereotype that creates a standard that you must be close to nature, and then there's the individual experience, which is, I haven't had any access to that. I don't have cultural teachings that tell me about that. And so we need to understand too that these things get applied in a way that take away from the full human experience.
Absolutely. We have a few more stereotypes here that we sort of brainstormed on. The second being about sort of dress and what, Indigenous people should wear. And I think that also goes to the final point on this slide is around, what are sort of symbols that go along with all Indigenous people in a very uniform way that doesn't really account for diversity or the ways that cultures and peoples change. So John Paul, do you see these things too where you are at?
Yeah, I remember talking to a grade 5 teacher who asked their students to draw a picture of an Indigenous person. And they had 30 students. This was a few years ago. And the startling thing was close to 2/3 of the pictures were identical. They had the same person wearing buckskin and feathers. And I can't remember if there were beads, but there was a teepee in the background and a bonfire. And the strange thing was they were almost all positioned in the exact same way. And that led the teacher to ask, why does the person stand in the same place in all of these pictures? And why is the teepee in the exact same place in all these pictures? And they discovered what they were drawing was what they saw at an interpretive site.
Oh.
I think it might have been Black Creek Pioneer Center, or it might have been somewhere else. But it was definitely like the same gaze they would have had as they walked through the interpretive site is the teepee is there, the person was there, and that's what they were wearing. And there was no sort of contextualization or sense of that this was like an individual's particular culture. So you kind of have this buckskin that stands in for all nations, and this idea of teepees or totem poles being universal, they kind of become the symbol for Indigenous people everywhere. And you kind of see like they get appropriated by Canada as a sign of Canadianism too. When you go abroad and you see Canada represented by a totem pole or something, or a nukshuk, that's the other one we see a lot is nukshuks. But when you kind of generalize these things, like all Indigenous people had teepees or all Indigenous people had totem poles, you lead to that problem of the same problem that's in the Indian Act, right? You've seen one, seen them all, you kind of treat all of them the same way. And that's problematic because it is dehumanizing. And so you see that other one you have there about, you need to dress a certain way. I think that's something that if we go through that wheel in a little bit, thinking about costumes and Halloween type costumes, one of the things that kind of results when you see someone like dehumanizing Indigenous people by wearing a costume that mishmashes all the different identities together into one is it kind of denies a sense of particularities and within cultures, so that there's always some kind of question or doubt in the minds of the settler person who's looking and saying, are you really authentically Indigenous because you don't have a spirit name, you don't dress in buckskin, and like I didn't have my beaded choker on today or my beaded earrings or my feathers. So then there's this question of, are you an authentic Indigenous person? And the thinking is like these codes that you get used to are a real sign of what that is.
Absolutely. Just to follow on what you're saying, John Paul, and I just want to let people know first of all that I'm reading the awesome chat that's happening too, as well as listening to John Paul. So thanks everybody for your input and just engaging in that conversation. That's really great. One of the things that I wanted to address before we jump off this slide really quickly is just one of the trends or one of the first steps, especially that when I work with teachers, particularly those who teach younger students, one of the things that they're really excited to do when they first start this work is to have students try to identify with like a clan or a spirit name. And I'm speaking largely with non-Indigenous classes and from non-Indigenous educators. And so I wanted to bring that up because I think for me, it's important to realize as a non-Indigenous person that there's so much about the clan system that I am not privy to. And it's complex, is from what my understanding. And, John Paul, you might take issue with that characterization, but I think it's not something that is like a zodiac sign or a, what color personality are you? We could take a test and we get sorted into like a Harry Potter sorting hat, right? Situation. It's actually something which is really important and is sometimes found through ceremony and sometimes passed down through elders. And literally, I know very little bit about it, but from what I do know, I know it's not something that should be trivialized. And so it's just a trend that I wanted to flag because it's something that I think we should stay away from. Do you have any thoughts on that, John Paul?
No, I'm glad you brought that up because it's like, again, that's a kind of let's break that down into a couple of things. First of all, you have this the slide where it says all Indigenous people have spirit names. So
sure.
First of all, not true, right? And again, that's that legacy of colonization thing again, where people have different relationships to naming and to traditional names and to knowing their spirit name or having it revealed to them or seeking it out or doing all of the things they need to do to discover who they are and then carry that name and hold that name. So there's usually a process that has to be gone through to receive a name. And so that leads to the problem with that second part where anyone can have one. And that's kind of like a new agey thing of thinking like, oh, I can also have a spirit name or have it revealed to me or go to a ceremony where suddenly my real name is given to me and that sort of thing. And it's offensive to many Indigenous people to know of people doing that kind of thing. I know you're going to find some Indigenous people who say that's fine, you can find that out, or you are entitled to do that work. And that doesn't mean that it's okay for everyone. If you're offending someone, you probably should think twice about it. And I think that when teachers do it, and to largely innocent young learners, they then walk away with this idea that, oh, I can do it too. I can have one too. And it even extends to like the spirit animal idea. So you mentioned clans, and many people's clans are animal totems in Anishinaabe world, and for Haudenosaunee people, it's different clans, but oftentimes you're born into them, right? So it's a family responsibility and obligation, and it sets out a series of relationships to other people and kinship. And for someone to just declare themselves having a certain kind of connection to an animal or a spirit or that something like that takes away all of that kind of understanding that emerges from within the culture.
Thanks for sharing that. That's really helpful and to clarify, and I think it provides a great perspective on this. So thanks. Yeah, thank you. So let's see what else we've got here. Ooh, more examples that I've come up with that from real life experience, John Paul. These are things I've heard, and I paraphrase one or two of them, but these are things I've heard from young people. I once had a young person in grade 3 at an end of a presentation come right up to me, and I thought the presentation went so well. I was leaving like, yes, we did this. I feel really good. And he was like, but wait, don't Indigenous people pay no taxes? I was like, oh, what? And that's coming from somewhere. So that was a big one. And, we know that is just not true, that, this whole totalizing statement here, all Indigenous people pay no taxes, but this is what he thought. And then, just going through the list, to be authentically Indigenous, you must live as your ancestors did, pre-contact. That one I see coming up so often, even with the university students I work with, that anything post-contact is just a deviation and, is not authentic anymore. I don't know, John Paul, those are two heavy ones right there. I don't know if you want to say anything else or if we can keep moving. What are your thoughts?
Well, that one you just mentioned because it's fresh, right? But living under amber or something, like trapped like a bug in amber, and you can't change or else you somehow lose your authenticity. It's interesting that Indigenous people aren't accorded that privilege of evolution, the way that settler people can evolve, and that's part of who they are, is that intellectually and they evolve and they progress to something better, and they develop technologies and they become more proficient with them, and that's all signs of progress, and it doesn't threaten the culture in any way. But if Indigenous people adapt technology or adapt ideas or technologies from another culture, somehow that makes them less Indigenous. They have to stay as they were at a certain point in time. And you really see this with Canadian court cases, that there seem to be these arbitrary time settings imposed upon a group to demonstrate that you must show that you did fish in this way prior to 1763, and if you don't do it the same way now or use the same nets or the same technology, then somehow you're less Indigenous, or you've shown that you've changed and therefore you're not accorded that Aboriginal right anymore. And so, and you can see different years used in different places, and sometimes it's about the point of contact shifting, and that becomes the historical marker for when you measure authenticity. Like, if they didn't do this afterwards, they're somehow less Indigenous. So there are really real consequences to these stereotypes. They get employed by judges in courtrooms. They get employed by teachers with their students. So that's why we're talking about it today. But this notion of the all Indigenous people pay no taxes, this is like another sign of how it's overgeneralized, right? So we see, like, if you were to really unpack that, you would find there are Indigenous people paying lots of tax. The ones who are employed off reserve and they can't escape income tax, and they pay taxes for most of the items they purchase. But if they go on to reserve, then they may indeed be able to make tax-free purchases. And if they have a status card and they can show it at a gas station on a reserve, then they won't pay tax on the gas, but they don't get free gas. That's another one I used to hear. I think it was made quite popular by the infamous Justin Bieber, who said, "I discovered I'm part Indian, so I get free gas," or something.
He said that. He said that. That's a real quote. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. But this notion is obviously like an over application, right? So most Indigenous people are paying taxes. There are treaties in place that have tax exemption as one side of the treaty, but it's important to look at what else in that treaty is not being lived up to, because the tax exemption is supposed to be one part of the exchange. So, like, here's access to land, and in return, tax exemption. But then the tax exemption has been so narrowly applied that most Indigenous people are paying taxes on things.
Absolutely.
And another part of that is the all Indigenous people get free tuition.
Ah, yes.
Which, again, overgeneralization of the post-secondary education assistance that Ottawa is providing, they say, on a whim. We argue it's a traditional right to education that was negotiated into many treaties, starting with Treaty 3 Treaty 3. And I think Treaty 6 has a provision as well that's very clear, but it got applied as a treaty right and then an Aboriginal right, but Ottawa still says it's very much like a policy that is at the whim of the government to help people who are further behind in addressing the education gap. And it's when you look at Indigenous people and who can access it and who can get the assistance and whether it actually covers all of their expenses, no one's really getting a free ride for education or for taxes. And then I see at the bottom here, maybe we should move on to those, but you have a couple more on the other side where we're victimizing Indigenous people and saying, they're all victims, or they all live in poverty. And you see even well-meaning people do this kind of thing too, where they are over applying this kind of notion of what the harms have been done to Indigenous people. And, I might even have said things that border on this today, where I talk about the legacy of colonization and so forth, and how it has affected many Indigenous people. But, if you only tell that part of the story, you could be contributing to this notion of creating victims out of Indigenous people, such to the point like you get even training of professionals like teachers, like social workers, and other helping professions, nursing. People come to look at Indigenous people as victims, and they just want to think of, how do I help, right? And it creates this, again, like a dehumanization of people.
Absolutely. Before we jump off this, I just wanted to go back and say one thing that I always bring up to my students when they're saying, I'm thinking more of my post-secondary students, when they're saying, oh, well, they get free this or free that. You have to remember that just that term free, like there was an exchange. First of all, the stereotype of free, just like as you just explained, John Paul, is, completely paints everything with one brushstroke, is completely inaccurate in terms of what actually is happening on the ground. But I think that the actual use of the word free denies this idea that settlers and non-Indigenous people have benefited too. Like technically, I'm allowed to live on this land for free. I mean, granted, you buy property and all these different things, but that use of the term free, is often weaponized against Indigenous people in a way that it isn't against non-Indigenous people.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's rent, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You look at the case in I guess it was the late 1840s, when Shingwak was preventing settlers from passing through territories around Sault Ste. Marie. And he just got to this point where he's like, unless you guys pay some kind of toll or a fee for access to the lands beyond here, you can't just keep coming on here and doing whatever you want. And I think that led to the Robinson treaties. So it's definitely not a free exchange, right?
Absolutely. Okay, let's keep moving. John Paul, just to sort of let you know where we're at, we've got about 15, 20 minutes before we want to wrap up. I know we want to get to, but we could go all night, if you know what I mean. But we wanted to get to these sort of ideas around stereotypes. I know you've touched on some of them, but please go on ahead.
Overgeneralize, I think we've covered that quite extensively, and even decontextualize. So we talked about how you kind of remove the history. So when you say things like Indians don't pay taxes, you're kind of missing the context of the treaties and who broke the treaty, or why is that promise even there, and who has access to land. That part's not getting talked about. So the decontextualization of stereotypes is an important part of it too, and how they work. And when you mentioned that piece being left out of the free tuition, that's an example of decontextualizing. Yeah.
Okay, so then we got to this slide about prejudice and discrimination. Talk to me about this.
Right, so this is a piece that's borrowed from the Sioux Lookout Anti-Discrimination Committee, who used a medicine wheel to talk about the way that stereotypes lead to prejudice, which lead to discrimination, which keep reproducing this racist societal structure. So we have these stereotypes, which some people might feel like it's innocuous. Like, okay, so what if a kid dresses up like Pocahontas? It's not the end of the world. It's just for fun. And really, shouldn't we just get over ourselves and find it humorous or whatever? But you see that it very subtly, especially when you layer them on top of each other, all these different stereotypes that you pointed out, if we have access to those in our schools and in our families and in society and in mass media, it leads to the development of attitudes. So we can follow the wheel around with the arrows that you have here. And a stereotype, which is something that exists outside of ourselves, it circulates in society, and we can choose to read it in certain ways. Like we can look at it and go, yeah, that's true, and you accept it. Or you can resist it. You can say, I see that's there, but I don't really buy that. But the ones who are accepting it or negotiating a meaning with stereotypes, it comes to form a part of their attitudes. And that's where prejudice happens. So if you can make a judgment about a person that you know nothing about, but you know they're a member of this group, and you say, well, I know this about this group, then you're acting in a prejudiced way. You're making assumptions about who they are based on their group status or membership. And so that's how the stereotype leads to that kind of attitude development. And the danger of that, of course, if we carry on to this wheel, is that when we apply power to prejudice, then we get discrimination. And so this is like when someone has a prejudicial attitude about a group, they might not recognize the bias that they carry, but they're in a position of power, then they can create actions that discriminate against that group. And so I mentioned court cases earlier. So having this kind of prejudice against oral tradition, say, or songs and stories as knowledge is what led to the first decision in the Delgamuukw case, which was in BC here in the 1990s. The person kind of rejected all presentation of songs and stories as legitimate legal evidence of occupation of land, and said, like, I don't really understand. Like, I have 10 years. I don't really understand what this song and story and dance is all about. But the Supreme Court of Canada overturned that and said oral tradition is in fact a valid form of knowledge, and there's a system to it. But you can kind of see how that power resided in the settler state, and that first provincial judge acting on that prejudice and applying power essentially discriminated against that group. And these kinds of things happen all the time, whether it's someone who's hiring and they look at a person and go, or they're renting a place out, say, as soon as they see what the person looks like, I'm sorry, that place is already rented. So the application of those prejudices with power is what discrimination is. And I don't know if you want to talk about reverse racism here and how that power piece is what really makes it not an applicable kind of thing. Like, you can be prejudiced against the settler group and kind of hold prejudices about white people or about men or about, and you pick a group that typically has power in society. Yes, you can be prejudiced against that group, but the ability to apply power to that prejudice is not really accorded to you, systemically, structurally. And that's why I think when people say that's reverse racism, I think they're really just kind of describing a form of prejudice, because I don't think you can have the discrimination work the other way, because the power really resides in most of those other groups most of the time. Do you want to say something about that?
You know what, John Paul, I actually think you did an amazing and succinct job of speaking about that, but I want to share an experience. I was speaking about discrimination and privilege and power and prejudice today with a group of grade sixes who, are at a school in Toronto where they have done work around social justice and identity. They're not, but it was their first time talking really about privilege, and they got it right away. And it's in a private school. The tuitions are a lot, and we're in an Ontario context. It's a high tuition. The students in my class mostly were white, but they got it right away. And so my point here is that I think from even young ages, young people can understand these concepts, right? And we talked about the difference between what it means for somebody who's in a position of power to enact a prejudice on someone else versus the other way around, and they totally got it. So how, and I clearly explained it a lot better to them this morning than I am right now. But the point is, like, it so often I find that when I'm speaking to teachers, like right now I'm talking to my teacher candidates right before they went out on practicum, and they were like, I just don't think kids are going to care. I just don't think kids are going to get it. And I get that, because before I walked into that class today, I'm like, I have no idea what they're going to take from this and where they're going to go. But they dove right in. The young people are able to engage with this material. So I always try to recognize, when is it my own resistance and my own fears that are holding me back from doing this work, and when is it actually the students? So I wanted to put that out there. And before I stop talking, I just wanted to see, and I know a lot of people have already participated. Erica has posted a poll in the chat about where on the wheel you feel, so our participants feel comfortable intervening as an educator. So many people have participated. I hope more of you will participate in that.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I see. It's going up. I was thinking about that prejudice plus power thing. The other thing to think about with that is how it is structural. So a lot of people, when they point out reverse racism or something like that, it's usually like a microaggression. I probably wouldn't use that word with the primary group,
Nope.
but it's one person against another individual. And it's not like the whole of a societal institution or structure, like a university or like a high school or like a courtroom or so on, where it's more than one person. It's the workings of many groups that create the kind of conditions for those things to become a way of doing things, which repopulate the status quo in a certain kind of power relationship between groups. But I want to address finally that one part of the wheel after the discrimination piece. What happens is if discrimination is enacted against a group of people or individuals who are members of a group, then what happens is you get two things. You get like support for the stereotype and for the discrimination, and you get a sense from the marginalized group of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is, so on the one hand, you get this support, which is, that's where like the truth of stereotypes comes about, where someone can point to a thing and say, you see, there's an example right there, it's true. There's a poor Indigenous person, or there's a homeless Indigenous person. It's just like I said, they're all like struggling with this. But it can also lead to that self-fulfilling prophecy, where if that Indigenous person who has been looking for work and is denied the opportunities because there are assumptions about they're always going to be late, or they're not going to come sober, or those kinds of, like, those prejudices acting, they might then actually start to take on those characteristics themselves and stop looking for work. So then they get pointed to as the unemployed, the large unemployed, visible population of Indigenous people. And that just, feeds the stereotypes. That's why the circle just keeps on going. So if you get people who act like the stereotype, they get pointed to as the support for the stereotype. It allows the stereotype to continue to hold its power. It leads to the prejudices being formed. The prejudices are acted upon as discrimination, and the wheel just keeps going around and around, which is why it's so important to think about, where can we as educators intervene and make that change? Like, can we stop it at the stereotype, at the prejudice, at discrimination? So it's interesting to see how people answer. I don't think that there is a right answer. I think it's a good exercise, though, to think about, where might I put my efforts? Mm-hmm. And like, discrimination has been one area where people have put in a lot of legal effort, because they can put laws in place that penalize people who demonstrate discriminatory practices. So you see that in different places, workplaces, around hiring practices and things like that. Stereotypes, I see there's a lot of people answering that way. Yes. I guess it's because you want to intervene there before it becomes ingrained in a person's being, before they internalize it and do something with it. So it's a very strategic place to try and intervene.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I just want to jump on and say too is that when I see this wheel, one of the things that is coming to my mind right now is the importance of having high expectations as an educator for Indigenous students, right? Because I hear you about that self-fulfilling prophecy, John Paul, and I think so oftentimes as an educator, we can internalize these stereotypes, and so we can lower expectations for Indigenous students, and maybe even get discouraged when they start showing signs of being disenfranchised or internalizing stereotypes or beliefs about themselves. But we actually, we have a lot of power to be that support person, to, not to save them, right, but to tell them that we care about them, that we believe in them, and that we know that they have more than just potential, that they are fully alive, aware human beings who will succeed. I think that's a powerful message that all students need, but when we're in this particular context, Indigenous students especially.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think if we raise our expectations, we'll be surprised how many rise to
absolutely. John Paul, and I just want to point out, we do have some questions coming in. Do you feel comfortable if we go to those? Okay. So
certainly, I normally I would run an example through these, but I think what's a good thing is if everyone who can see it, this slide can try it on their own later and see how picking any stereotype and running it through, you might see how it works.
that sounds like a great idea. Absolutely. A little bit of homework. You can tell we're educators, no problem. But I love it. No, I think it's absolutely something. And you know, let's see what some of these questions are coming in from folks. Hazel asks, I am wondering, when we try to be culturally inclusive in the urban classroom, should our efforts be focused on just our children to be able to overcome these nasty stereotypes?
In the urban classroom, I think it applies everywhere. And, you know, in terms of overcoming the stereotypes, I mean, there's a reason that it's powerful. Like, our brains are hardwired to make snap judgments. And I think this is where like stereotypes come from, is the ability to kind of pull a lot of information together and make a generalization based on that. And so it's kind of a natural process almost, which is what makes it so hard to step back, think critically, and intervene in a way. And so giving all children the tools to think critically and say, why do you think this about a person? Or how can you make that assumption from this limited information and go from that to this? The more you can slow it down and consciously look at it and explore biases and prejudices, then the more likely we are to make some kind of an intervention in the development of those prejudices from stereotypes. So I would say yes, but not just urban.
Everywhere. John Paul, you know, there's one or two, maybe even 3 or 4 more questions. Do you have time to stay a little bit later today if we go maybe 5 or 7 minutes over? How do you feel about that?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, great. So hopefully folks will stay with us, you know, or watch the video after if you have to run. So Harriet asks, where do we get new documents or maybe resources, as she might be alluding to, that more accurately reflect Indigenous peoples?
That is such a good question. Yeah, and the thing is, I guess one of the things that I struggled with, because I get asked all the time, what resource should I use? And there's no one perfect resource. I think the thing is to think about what are the limitations and the strengths of each resource that we see in front of us. And you know, you might look at a book or video and say, this does X really well, but it's missing Y. We don't even get into gender with this one, or something like that. So then you search for that, what's missing, in a different source, and you kind of combine them so that you're trying to provide as complete a picture as possible. So you'll never find one perfect resource. But that said, there are many really good ones, and I think there's a lot of good portals that lead to these good resources. So Angela and I work together on the Deepening Knowledge Project at OISE, U of T, and so that portal exists that points to many great resources that are out there. Alberta government has a good one. BC government has a good one. The First Nations Education Steering Committee out here in BC has a really good one too. Even the Martin Family Initiative has a good collection of resources for teachers to use. So there are things out there that you can connect to find good teaching materials. Interesting.
John Paul, we're getting some interesting questions here. Oh boy. So Rashmi asks that, or rather tells us that an ongoing challenge that they're experiencing as a racialized person who's doing this work is the pushback. If you care so much, why don't you go back to where you came from? What are some ways, beyond speaking of the big picture of how that they washed up on the shores of Turtle Island, that you might recommend to sort of answer that? I know I have one, but I wonder what you might say.
No, fair. You should be answering this then.
I got one.
Too, but I think this is something that we have we've heard this question before. We've struggled with this question before because everyone who's like that word settler is I think a difficult one to work with. It's hard for people to take that identity on, and especially when everyone's circumstances for arriving on Turtle Island are different.
Yes.
And so we have to really acknowledge that not everyone came here of their own kind of steam, right? Like it's not necessarily a choice for every person who finds themselves here. Even the ones who have some kind of perception of choice may have been pushed out of the lands they escaped from, like a refugee status kind of thing, where they may have made their own way here, but what they were leaving is so much more dangerous. So there's a different relationship to this land for each person identifying, and there's different connections and ways of aligning and being and becoming allies, finding solidarity with Indigenous struggles. And so it's really hard to find one answer to this, but I know that people will use this kind of logic, I guess, of why don't you go back to where you came from? And it's not so simple for anyone and everyone to just leave. And that's a reality I think that many Indigenous people have thought about as well, in terms of what is the relationship to newcomers, both racialized and not, or, well, what do you mean by not? Racialized in a different way. So that there's so many different relationships and connections that there isn't really one way to answer. But I think it's important to recognize everyone comes from a place, and everyone has a connection to the land they're on and the people who have a connection with that land from time immemorial. And exploring what is the nature of that relationship is what we should be looking at, rather than returning to a past, an imagined past a lot of times.
Yeah, just to add on to what you're saying, John Paul, in the last 11 years of doing this work and listening to different Indigenous community members and working in different Indigenous communities, urban, remote, hearing elders speak, no one has ever said, and now everybody who's not Indigenous needs to go home, right? Like, what I've rather heard is, how can we return to better relationships if ever we were in good relationships, right? How can we right relations? And so for me, doing this work as a non-Indigenous person, that is the question that's always in my mind. And I think part of the work is this Indigenous education. I think for me, that is, and I don't even know if I'm using this metaphor right, is like a red herring that people just throw in there, right? Okay, well, then we should all just go back. Like, oh, it's that simple. Like, and obviously we're not. So then we shouldn't even discuss this problem. We shouldn't even discuss how to make things a little bit better, because we're not going to go back. So for me, it's just a distraction technique.
Yeah, and usually that place that has been left it only exists in the mind. It's not, they don't stay the way that you left them.
Yes.
I was just looking at this question about authentic reading material at primary level. I think there's Good Minds is a resource for all education, Indigenous education resources. But I'm thinking there is a book series, and I think you must know it, Angela. What is the primary readers?
Ooh, this is my favorite question. Okay, so Nelson and Pearson both have leveled readers, which were made in consultation and with Indigenous folks / have Indigenous authors and artists involved. I love them. I love them. One is called Turtle Island Reads. One, I think, yes. One is called something about a circle. And one is called Under One Sun, and that's a Nelson one for sure. And Under One Sun is about treaty education from K and up. So those are really great places to start.
And I'm drawing a blank right now, but I know my friend Sarah Davidson was involved with a whole series, and she's at University of Fraser Valley. I imagine if you Google it, you could find it.
Okay.
Just Type in that info and you'll find that series. But it's another good one.
Just another question, John Paul, maybe before we say goodbye today and give our last final thoughts here. And again from Harriet, does it make sense to start teaching about present-day Indigenous peoples if students have no history or context to understand how the situation got here? Or do we start with pre-contact to understand what has been lost? Like where do we start? And I love that question. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason we have to teach things chronologically. It makes a lot of sense to start with today and make good connections and associations with it. I'm always moved by this kindergarten teacher candidate that we had a few years ago who said, my job is just to make the students feel good and have a good connection with the idea of Indigenous. I'm not going to quiz them on what is Indigenous, what's Aboriginal, what's First Nations, but we'll have some of their food, and yes, there is some problems when it's only ever food and dance and that sort of thing, but in the very earliest days, they just have a good connection. It's like, we're going to eat bannock. Everyone has a bread tradition and from where they're from, and this is an Indigenous tradition. So what do you guys think? It's yummy. And they just have a good warm feeling. And he's like, it's up to the next level, and grade 1, 2, 3 will start scaffolding on those good feelings to then work backwards, so that it's helping to humanize the Indigenous people as contemporary individuals who do things that I can relate to. And then when you start to look at histories and legacies and stuff, that's when you start to go, oh, this is a travesty of justice. And you start to put things together in a way that, if you don't have a human idea of them in the first place, how do you see the kinds of things that have been done as dehumanizing?
And I think we have to remember, and we have to strive for not just this. And I know it's hard as individual teachers when nobody else in your staff might be on board, but the more and more what I'm seeing is whole school approaches, right? If you can't cover every single thing in 1 year, it's okay, because next year or the year before, people have your back on this topic, right? So I really encourage folks, and some of the work that I do is going around to schools and mapping out what's happening in the school about Indigenous education and when, and what gaps do we have, right? Just so that not one person feels the entire burden of doing this work. Because, we also have other subjects to teach, right?
That's true. Yeah, and I think that's more needs to be done on that work, kind of working together and working across, because I worry that everyone's kind of getting the message that residential schools are an important topic to cover, and I worry that they get covered in the same way all the time, so that by the time you get to, I don't know, high school, you just hear the same surface material over and over and over again, and you haven't gone deeper with it, and you haven't made connection with it in a more physical or emotional way. So if there's ways to do that work, it improves it, and it's good to build on what they've learned earlier, right? I mean, we do it with maths and sciences. We should get better at it with Indigenous topics, but it's also not just content. It's whether we can do the teaching in an Indigenous way as well. Can we embody those pedagogies in ways that teach through the body and through emotion? But that sounds like maybe a topic for another.
It does. And I think, John Paul, with that, we should start to bring today to a close. We've talked about this. Ooh, here we go. So just to let folks know, first of all, thanks everybody for joining us. And I know that many people who will be watching this on video afterwards. So thank you for signing up to be part of this, to receive this recording. John Paul, do you have any final notes on anything we've said in sum, or anything that you want to alert people to as we say goodbye?
I guess just that when we look at all of these topics, it can get confusing, and sometimes people want to turn away, and it'd be easier just to do nothing. And I worry that we can't do that. We have to challenge the status quo, all of the things that we see that are problematic. If we just turn away from it as teachers, we're not going to intervene and make the changes that need to be made. And it can be scary, but mistakes will be made, but we got to learn from them. And it's better to learn from a mistake than try to run away and avoid it in the first place.
I think that's perfect advice. And I want to just reiterate that, we can't be paralyzed by our own fear or our guilt. It's really important. Like, that doesn't really help anybody. It's normal to feel those things, but it's important to find that support that you need to move through those emotions and keep moving, right? This is our time. We can't let this information go and these stereotypes go unchallenged for another generation. Real things are at stake here. Real lives, and equity for Indigenous folks, and justice. So with that, I want to remind folks that as you exit our webinar today, you'll go directly to a survey that John Paul's created that we hope you'll participate in as part of the research that John Paul's doing. You can also sign up for my free newsletter, which comes usually once every 2 weeks, once every 3 weeks, right to your inbox, and that's free. And you can find my blog and my newsletter at angelanardozi.com/listen and learn. Anything else, John Paul, as we say goodbye?
Oh, just that it is appreciated if you can do the survey, because it helps us to help you. And as our project goes forward over the next couple of years, we hope to be putting out, many resources dealing with the things teachers have told us about that they struggle with and want help with. And the best way we can help you is if you tell us where you need help. Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you, John Paul, for hanging out with me tonight. And yeah, it was amazing to see all the awesome chat that was happening on the side. And thank you to Erica as well, who's part of John Paul's team over at UVic. And thank you to Danny, who's part of my marriage and my technical team over here in Toronto for helping us out again today with this webinar.
Yes, Chimigwech, everyone. Thank you for your participation, and thanks, Angela, for bringing us together, Danny for making it work, and Erica for being a strong support of it all, too.
Thumbs up. Okay, so with that, good night to my friends at UVic, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Night.